one of my biggest bugbears with organizations is that they try and achieve business change through technology. And my view would be that technology is an enabler of business change. It's not the thing that creates the business change itself. In order to create business change, you have to take the people on that journey. You have to change the way they think about things, the way they work, the way they do things, their workflows, their processes.
So today I'm joined by media consultant Nicky Goldberg. Welcome, Nicky.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. You've had a career that's spanned more than 2 decades in the broadcast industry.
Made me feel very old when you say that.
We'll let that hang a little. Can you just tell us a little bit about your journey and how you became a player in the broadcast industry, so to speak?
So I was very lucky to have my start in student radio. I think if everybody could have their start in student radio, that would just be a very good thing. I arrived at university back in 1996, 97, just as a group of students there were starting up Oxygen 107.9 FM.
Oh.
And I owe much of my career to the couple of years I spent working with that team. Many of them remain friends to this day. And I can still back time a television or radio program precisely to the top of the hour to hit the news bulletin at the top of the hour, because once you learn a skill like that, you never really forget again. So I did that. I then did a master's in journalism, and I ended up working in the United States for 2 or 3 years. I started there before September 11th, and I was working in Washington the day of September 11th. So that was a really formative experience for me. And then I came back to the UK and joined the BBC. I started as a freelance producer on BBC World News, the international English language news channel, and stayed there. I had a really happy 10 years there as I worked in pretty much every production role in the newsroom, commissioning graphics, writing scripts, doing the on-screen text, ultimately outputting bulletins, editing bulletins, and becoming a team leader there. And that's really where I learned the craft of journalism. And then spent the next 10 years at the BBC doing a whole range of things, working on technology projects. I worked for BBC World Service for several years, helped build studios, helped design and build social media studios. And then the last couple of years, spent time as the head of operations for BBC News in London, managing all of the TV and radio digital studios in London and the more than 300 amazing creative professionals that work in them.
Wow, that's quite a journey that you've been on there.
That's the potted history.
So as someone who's led large multidisciplinary teams in high-pressure broadcast environments, what are some of the key leadership principles or strategies that you've found most effective for managing creative and technical professionals?
So I love managing and leading creative teams. It's really, really fun. And one of the things that I think makes a huge difference is if you've walked in their shoes. I was never quite a sort of technical person. I wasn't a director. I wasn't a camera crew. But having worked in a newsroom for as long as I did, I really understand a lot of their challenges. I've spent untold hours in galleries and control rooms, often in the middle of the night. I know what it's like to do a night shift. I know what it's like to be on deadline. I know what it's like to be in a really difficult broadcast news environment. And so having that background, I think, gives you a lot of credibility as a leader, because you're able to understand some of the challenges and the frustrations that when kit goes wrong, or management aren't listening, or it's the middle of the night on a night shift and things just don't look the same as they do. So one of the things that I did the day I took over as head of operations in London at BBC News, the very first day I spent on the job, I came in and spent on the night shift because I'm very well used to teams of night shift people feeling like they're never listened to, they're never seen, they never see a manager, and their perspective's never taken into account. So rather than doing my first day on a Monday morning, I did my first day on a Sunday night and sat with the night shift all through the night and just listened to them and started to get an idea of how things look from their perspective. So I think if I was to give a tip, that would be my number one tip. If you haven't done the role yourself, then at least try and learn as much as you can about the role. Really try and understand the language that people use, the way that they talk about things, how things look from their perspective. And that will really help you gain credibility with teams and be able to, when there are difficult decisions to make or difficult changes to have to go through, you really are able to walk through that change with them because they trust you as a leader.
So it's more about really people than it is about, technical solutions or software or things that they're actually using or operating. It's the people themselves that are...
So that would be my perspective. And that's, I think, the perspective that I bring into consultancy is that I think the kit is incredibly important. The working environment is incredibly important. Having the right hardware, the right software is really, really important. But all of those things are enablers for the people. It's people who come to work every day. It's people who have to work with each other. It's people who have to operate the kit, and understanding those people, understanding the relationships between them, understanding how they interact with the kit. One of my biggest bugbears with organizations is that they try and achieve business change through technology. And my view would be that technology is an enabler of business change. It's not the thing that creates the business change itself. In order to create business change, you have to take the people on that journey. You have to change the way they think about things, the way they work, the way they do things, their workflows, their processes. And a great bit of technology is a fantastic enabler to that. But if a management team just buy a piece of technology and give it to some users and hope that they'll change the way they work, that, to me, in all of my experience, that never really happens. If you give a team a system to collaborate, a collaboration system, and then come back a year later and say, why aren't they collaborating? It's because the system doesn't generate the collaboration. The people generate the collaboration, and you've got to bring the people along with you on that journey.
So that's interesting. So what you're saying is that you can't just solve it with a solution that is technical. You actually have to change everything around that technical solution and get everybody on board with it to drive it forwards and make it work.
Technology is the enabler, and good technology can be a fantastic enabler, and it can be a really great catalyst for change. But the really important thing is it's the people and the culture. And in order to change workflows and to get business benefits, you've got to change the culture. You've got to encourage people to come along on that culture change journey.
That's interesting, because that's not a debate that you hear very widely, and it's not something that's discussed very widely that you see at events and conferences that we've both been at. That we don't really talk about that in that way.
I think at conferences I've been to in recent months, it's starting to percolate through. I think people are starting to realize that we might get on later to talk about the changing nature of the industry. And I think the industry is changing so fast and so profoundly. I think people are realizing now that we're in a slightly different world where you can't just go out and spend a very large amount of money on a very big system and hopefully that will solve all your problems. That you've got to have the right culture and you've got to have the right skills and the right people. And that technology is a big part of that, but it's the people that really matter. And I am starting to sense a little bit of a change in the industry, that's being discussed more than it used to be.
And that's really fascinating. I could talk about that for longer, but I've got other questions to ask. Okay, so the broadcast industry has undergone significant digital transformation, a little bit like what we were just talking about there, particularly with things like the rise in streaming and podcasting and on-demand content. So what do you see are the biggest opportunities and the biggest challenges for broadcasters today in those spheres? Because the digital sphere is something that certainly I can feel that people are struggling with how to deal with that.
So I think for me, the biggest opportunity is the creativity that it brings. We're seeing a lot of things become much more lightweight, much more efficient, much more easy to get done than they might once have been. The studio that we're sitting in today is an infinitely more lightweight and flexible studio than it might have been 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And the capital costs to getting anything done are massively shrinking. And that's really exciting. We're opening up new ways of telling stories. We're opening up new ways of getting contributions into those stories. AI is just going to turbocharge that and bring it to a whole new level. The biggest obstacle that I found isn't in any single piece of kit or any single workflow. It's the clash of cultures between those who have grown up in the traditional broadcast industry and those who are coming up in the digital industry. Generally, broadcasters and broadcast engineers started in a world of cables and heavy kit and in a kind of pre-digital age. In the digital world, many people grew up in print and then came into video and audio and that kind of thing. Each side has a huge amount of value to bring to the conversation, but they speak totally different languages. They use different systems, they use different protocols, different standards. And I was going to say, if you put them in a room together, they don't talk the same language, but they often don't even sit in the same room. In lots of the organizations that I've been involved with, they sit in different rooms, different parts of the country often, and they have completely different ways of looking at the world. So broadcast people aren't really used to some of the conventions of the web, and digital people often aren't really used to the sort of ways of reliability and monitoring and standards that the broadcast people have. An example of that, if we've got a second, is I grew up in a broadcast world where even a second of dead air, even a few milliseconds of dead air, is a massive crisis. And then you work with digital people who are like, oh, it just buffered for a moment. The audience totally understands buffering. That's not really something that they worry about. And so we don't really monitor for that because we sort of understand that buffering's a thing. And actually, you're coming from two very different philosophies of how to handle kind of on-air reliability. And as digital video becomes more like as digital video and broadcasting converge and digital streams become more like broadcast streams and broadcast streams become more like digital streams, these teams are being forced to work together, but often using completely different principles and protocols and workflows, and bringing those together is really more tricky than I would have imagined.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it's almost like the standard. There's one standard for streaming and there's one standard for broadcast. Of course, in this is still like that. And also this kind of siloing, actually. You've got this siloing, even though the content or the story, for instance, could be the same. You've got the digital team working in one silo and the production team for the news show working in another.
Where that becomes really tricky is when you have those two teams operating in the same building, and increasingly an editor wants to be able to just nimbly change between the two things. Like, oh, well, this was a stream, but now we want to put it on television. Or this was a TV program, and now we want to put it on the web. And when you have to kind of cross those divides with a single piece of content, you actually find that there's a lot more friction between those worlds than we would hope. And I think that can make things really tricky.
I mean, we also hear quite a lot about how the creators now are making more content than the standard media companies. When I say content, I mean getting at more eyeballs than the standard media companies time after time now. So we're getting into this point where YouTube, is overtaking as the delivery platform, and just curious about your thoughts on that kind of thing.
So I think you're right. There's a proliferation of content creators. We know that that's been happening for a long time now. And what you're seeing is some of those content creators, the real breakthrough ones, are becoming real players in their own right. And it's not clear to me that legacy broadcasters are necessarily going to be able to keep up with them. So there's a couple of potential routes to go. One way is for legacy broadcasters to go to the very, very high quality end of the market, things that individual content creators will struggle to keep up with. The other option is to work with content creators, and the legacy broadcasters increasingly become more of a kind of commissioning house, and where they might once have gone to an independent production company, they're going to individual content creators, and it's going to be really interesting to see how that ecosystem plays out, because I'm not sure that there's that many content creators who have the infrastructure and the compliance culture to work with legacy broadcasters. But I do think you might start to see some really interesting alliances there.
I also think, just to add to that, is also this idea of live streaming, like live, old is new again. Because particularly when we're talking about fake news and stuff like that, is that I think the proliferation, certainly in the news sphere, of being able to push a news story out live and be able to cover that on a live channel, say on YouTube. So let's say, for instance, the main news will deviate away from that story, but we can keep that story running on its own channel on YouTube and satisfy the user requirements of viewing that content continuously as a live stream.
I think that's a really interesting development. Probably one of the most interesting developments in kind of the news output space at the moment is this ability to not just have a single program or a single live channel, but to be able to do story-centric live workflows. It's a really compelling proposition for audiences. The fact that I can just click on a push alert and be taken straight to live content about the story that I'm really interested in is a really compelling proposition. And one of the things that I think we're seeing is that there are some things that would have just been once upon a time a feed of a public inquiry. Once upon a time would have just been a feed into the newsroom, and some poor journalist would have been assigned to watch it day in and day out just in case somebody said something interesting, which would have been clipped up for the evening news. It turns out that some of those public inquiries have quite a significant audience. And actually, if you can put that public inquiry out as an individual stream, you can get an audience that is really interested in the content, that potentially is a community around that content, and sees the ability to kind of watch that content, perhaps with a bit of expert analysis every so often, perhaps with some additional graphics, that can be a product in its own right. And actually, I think some of the more enlightened broadcasters are seeing that as a really interesting way forward, to be able to provide those kinds of things for their audience alongside the more traditional live news channel.
I love that old is new again idea. And what I also believe about that is that there's the ability for the audience to interact in a way that we've never had before, because, we can use QR codes or social media stuff and feed the graphics directly from that stuff, and they can have a say, and then you've got this kind of two-way conversation, particularly between a presenter or whoever's voicing the content, to be able to say, we had a question about this, and to weave the audience back into it, which makes an even more compelling live experience.
Absolutely. And you're able to build communities. I mean, everything I do kind of comes back to people in the end. One of the really compelling things about live as a concept is there's that sense of everybody standing around a television and watching something play out. Like, one of the things I always say to people about kind of the future of television, is television ever going to die? Look what happens when there's a really big news story. Even today, when everybody has a mobile phone around their hands, if you're in any communal area, if you're outside on the street, if you're in an airport, and there's a big breaking news story, if the American president's giving a speech or whatever, you see everybody clustered around the TV screen. You do not see everybody clustered around looking at your phones, because a big live news event, witnessing a big live news event, is fundamentally a communal experience. And at the macro level, at the big level, you do that on a big national television channel. But if you can do that with a community of like-minded people who are all really interested in this public inquiry, then you kind of get the same experience. We're all sharing this experience live. We're all really interested in this thing. And there's a ready-made community of really interested people. And that's exactly the kind of people that news organizations want to reach out to.
That's fascinating. That's actually, I never thought of it like that. That's very interesting. Okay, so you've overseen some 24/7 operations for major live productions, including things like the BBC's programmes like the 6 o'clock and the 10 o'clock news, for instance, and special election coverage you've also overseen. So what are the most critical factors to you for ensuring smooth and reliable operations? In broadcasting? That's an interesting question.
It's a very interesting question, and I think the important thing is to say that the most important thing is that it looks smooth and reliable on the front end. As long as the audience feel that it's smooth and reliable, that's two-thirds of the battle.
Yeah.
As we all know, there can be an awful lot of paddling under the scenes, but as long as the audience don't see that, then that's okay. I think partly it's about preparation. A lot of it is about training. One of the things that I've always enjoyed about working in those big breaking live news situations in the studio, I've always been more of a studio-based person than a field-based person. There are plenty of people who love being out in the field on the end of a very long string, just a satellite phone and a backpack in the middle of nowhere. That's less been my career. I've mostly spent time in newsrooms and studios, and the bit that I love about that is being surrounded by a group of people who are really well trained, who are well drilled, and who kind of really know each other's strengths and weaknesses and kind of really get each other. Because even when you're in a very high pressured, right against deadline world, because you know that you can throw a problem at somebody else, or you know that this person will be able to pick something else up in the moment, you just need to glance at somebody and give them a look, and you know that they'll handle whatever it is. And that, to me, is one of the things that makes a live broadcast studio just one of the most exciting places in the world. And I love spending time in studios because of that. And there are plenty of times when I've gone into a studio with a third of a running order filled, and we're just going to have to sort of build it on the fly. And then that sort of sense of teamwork and camaraderie just becomes so important.
Interesting. So in your experience, has the role of technology in live production environments evolved, and what innovations do you still think need to happen to support the production teams? I mean, you have touched on that a little bit, but
so it's a really good question. I think over the time of my career, everything has gotten smaller, lighter, more flexible, and everybody will recognize that. I talked about my student radio days, and then we'd moved on from slicing tape with razor blades to mini discs. Some people might remember the mini disc period.
I remember.
Very short, glorious. And the single greatest problem with the mini disc was it was a really nice little piece of technology, but they were very thin and very flat, and you could easily lose them under a pile of paper. And we once lost an entire broadcast because all of the material that we recorded for that broadcast was on a mini disc, and we could not find it on the chaotic desk of paper before we went to air. Had to rebuild the whole program again. Everything has gotten smaller and lighter, more flexible. And then over the last few years, increasingly things have moved from hardware into software. And I think that's been an incredibly powerful change and really, really valuable. It's enabled remote production. It's enabled studios to become much lighter, much smaller, much more sustainable, much cheaper, which has been brilliant. But you ask kind of what's the next stage? The thing that I'm always struck by is that generally speaking, whenever a development like that has happened, the workflows that those technologies work to are replications of workflows that we used to have before. So the number of digital systems that I have seen that effectively replicate tape-to-tape editing. We might be using file transfer, but we've built the file transfer system in a way that was first developed when we were ingesting film or videotapes. I think there's quite a lot of really exciting stuff to think about. How, now that we've got all of these amazing tools at our fingertips, how do we use them to tell stories in different ways, to build output in different ways? We're only just starting to see how AI might impact on that. But I think there's a real opportunity to start to think about how we use the tools that we have in ways that are fundamentally different from the way that we used to use them. Because if I walk into a broadcast gallery, even a very modern broadcast gallery, it still looks and feels cooler than it used to, and everything's on flat screens. But often a flat screen has a multi-viewer that looked as it did when it was a bag of televisions all built together.
Yeah,
and surely we must be able to do better than that.
Yeah, no, I agree. You just touched on AI there. So things like automation and artificial intelligence, they're increasingly being used by broadcasters, of course. How can broadcasters strike the right balance? There's the word, balance. Between the automation and the AI and maintaining the human creative aspects that are the strengths of humans, I'd say.
So it's a really great question. And if I knew the answer to it, I'd be a very successful consultant indeed, but hopefully I can help people come to the answer to it. I think that we're incredibly early in the AI revolution. And one of the things I've really been struck by in the last kind of 18 months is that you go to a conference or you hear somebody from a big company giving a speech about AI, and nearly always what they say is, yeah, we're doing a lot of work in AI in our organization, whether we're a broadcaster or a content creator, but doing a lot of stuff with AI, particularly around transcription and translation and a whole bunch of other things. And then they never specify what the whole bunch of other things are. It always comes back to making really big strides in transcription and translation. And we're almost sure it will help us with a whole bunch of other things, but we're just not quite sure what those are yet. I'm sure that there will be a whole bunch of other things as well. And I think we're just in the very early stages of that. I think keeping a human in the loop is going to be really vital, but there are lots of really drudge tasks in broadcast operations. If we could get AI to take some of that drudgery out of it and let the creatives do the really creative work. One of the things that you were involved in last year was the IBC Accelerator that looked at the impact of AI in galleries. And one of the things that I think that's really exciting about is if we could use AI to let directors just take a bit of a step back from the computers in front of them and look at really watch the output and think about the output and think about how they can develop the output creatively. If we could use AI to kind of free up that director to do what directors really should be doing, rather than trying to have their hands on 3 different keyboards and make sure all the automation works as it should, that would be a really compelling way of actually returning some creativity to directors that they've often in recent years been lacking.
And it's true that when you say that they've been lacking that, because before they had a big crew in front of them, so they had someone on the vision mix, they had somebody on the graphics, etc. And the automation thing has shrunk the footprint in the gallery, so they're more really of a technical operator than they are what the director should be, a creative person assessing the output and making it.
So this is where I think AI gets really exciting. Automation has done some really interesting things, and it's been great for efficiency, but it's sort of fundamentally built on templating. And mixing creativity and templating is really hard. I think where AI brings a really exciting opportunity is to continue with some of that efficiency, but bring the creativity back into it. That I think is really exciting.
Yeah, by freeing up the director's hands from certain technical tasks so that you can focus on the content.
And get their eyes back onto the output, because that's where AI is really going to struggle. It's kind of, how can I make this output really exciting? Yes, you could get AI to mix a broadcast based on some predefined rules, but if you really want to have an output creatively mixed, that's where you need an experienced director.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. And just going back to your experience we were talking about breaking news earlier. What did covering events like the war in Ukraine and COVID teach you about the unique demands of live and breaking news coverage?
COVID has really, like all of us, really sort of changed the way that I look at things. For most of my career, I was in broadcast newsrooms, and I was used to a world in which people could just stand up and look at each other's eyes or yell at each other and say, we need this now, we need to do that, or share information really easily. And that's something that a lot of my early breaking news experience was based on. There's little that is more efficient than just bringing the relevant people together in a quick huddle, having a quick conversation, and then sending them all off again to do the various tasks. And the impact that COVID had on that was quite profound. The fact that you couldn't all stand together in newsroom, and many of the teams that I work with did have to spend day in and day out in the office all the way through COVID, and trying to replicate those things over teleconferencing, over Zoom, over Skype, over whatever. You can achieve an awful lot, but you do lose a little bit of that element of kind of everybody being in the same room together. And of all the things that I've seen in terms of the advantages of remote production, and it's great in lots of ways. It's great for sustainability. It's great for efficiency. It's great for bringing all the right talent to the right place. The single greatest challenge I've had in any remote production that I've had is getting the communication right.
Comms is everything.
It's always comms. It's always comms. And however good your comms system is, it's never quite as good as everybody sitting in the same room together.
Exactly.
And that, I think, is something that I really feel quite keenly.
Thanks for all of that. It's been really interesting. I could probably talk to you for hours. But I'm just going to ask you one more question. This is a question we ask all of our guests. So what's the best piece of advice, either personally or professionally, that you've ever been given by anyone?
That is a great question. I often think back very fondly to my first executive producer. This was back at ABC in America, and a piece of advice that he gave me more than 20 years ago now. And at first it seems quite harsh, but then the more you think about it, the better it is and the more optimistic it is. And it's nobody's thinking about you. It's just that nobody's thinking about you. And at first you think, oh, why is no one thinking about me? And then you think, no. Actually, that's a really optimistic thing. Because when I go into the room thinking, oh my God, is everybody wondering why my hair is like that? Or everyone's going to notice that I was running late and kind of everyone, no one's going to think I'm prepared enough for this meeting. Or, I'm in a situation where I really don't feel confident. I've got imposter syndrome. Everyone's going to realize I've got imposter syndrome. And the reality is everyone's thinking about their own lunch, or they're quite hungry, or, have they got their notes for this meeting? And the reality is generally 9 times out of 10, nobody's thinking about you. And that's a wonderful thing.
Interesting. I'll take that with me. Thank you, Nicky.
It's been a pleasure.
If you want to find Nicky, you can find him on LinkedIn on his profile, Nicky Goldberg. And you can also look at nickygoldberg.com. Is that correct? Good. If you want to get in touch with Nicky about consultancy. So thanks for watching the episode. I'll put all of Nicky's details in the show notes underneath, and we'll see you on the next one.